This is Mr. Coates, and today we're going to look at agriculture. This is APES lecture number 35, and we're going to talk about mostly now about the history of some agriculture and then get into the industrialized agriculture that we see. If you look at these pictures, this is obviously pictures of industrialized agriculture. We have large machines, combines, we have several of them at the same time. We have a monoculture, which is this crop of wheat right here that is just acres and acres of the same wheat. Then we have a feedlot up here. Feedlots have large amounts of cattle, chickens, or pigs where they fatten them up using all kinds of different feeds as well as hormones, and then they are sent to a market. So our largest amount of plants we use for agriculture are our wheat, rice, and corn. These account for quite a lot of the caloric intake that we have here. 47% of the human calories that we get come from wheat and rice. And we talked about famine earlier and how those people with kwashiorkor don't get enough protein, but they are supplied with enough wheat and rice. If we could get them some protein, then they wouldn't have that disease. Now, a problem with a lot of these plants is that they are annuals, and annual plants only grow for 1 year, and then they have to be replanted. So a lot of these plants don't come back. So every time they have to be replanted, you have to till up the soil, refertilize them, they grow up, you harvest them, and then plant dies, and then you have to replant again. So there's a lot of energy, and there's a lot of time spent on farming these large crops. The other bad thing is that we have really limited the amount of plant species that we use for crops. 15 to 20 different plant species now in the United States supply 90% of our actual food needs. In the past, we had hundreds and maybe even close to thousands of different plants that provided our food. However, because of modern agriculture, we need high yields, and so a lot of those other species don't provide a lot of food, whereas these 15 to 20 produce a lot of food and you can plant large areas. Another thing is that we here in the United States, we feed a lot of our livestock grains that we grow in our country. Fortunately, the grain is kind of wasted. If you remember the rule of 10, and when we feed those grains to the livestock, 90% of the energy or the calories locked up in that grain is wasted. Only 10% of those calories are transferred to the meat. This is why we get 16 pounds of grain only produce 1 pound of edible meat, and that's not very efficient. And so we're wasting a lot of time planting wheat, rice, and corn for animals that we're going to eat later. Now, there are different types of agriculture out there. One of the first is traditional agriculture. This is when agriculture first started. You still see this in developing countries, but traditional agriculture is where you have a family and they have a small farm plot next to their house and they farm enough food just to feed themselves. They use rudimentary tools like we see axes or these hoes right here that they're using to farm their little plot of land. They also spend a lot of time with children out in the fields. Child labor is very important in these instances. So this is traditional subsistence agriculture, and it produces usually only enough food for the family. Typically they don't have any livestock, they have no machinery, very hard living. They got to spend a lot of time out in their fields tending their food. Now, a little bit of a step upwards is this traditional intensive agriculture. In this case, you might have a little bigger of a plot. You might have some farm animals that help you plow the fields and harvest whatever. You may employ other families on your farm, and you may produce enough food to feed those families, yourself, and maybe even sell some at market. You still don't produce a mass amount for other countries like we do in the United States. Also, a type of traditional agriculture is slash and burn agriculture. This is mostly found in tropical areas, in tropical rainforest areas, where they will actually burn the forest down. They will then till the soil up and plant their crops. And there are some problems with this. Obviously, habitat destruction is one. The soil left behind after they do the burning is often very devoid of any kind of nutrients and often supports crop growing for only a couple seasons. And then the fields have to lay fallow for 10 to 15 years in order to gain nutrients again. And so this is not a very efficient way to farm either. And unfortunately, it's destroying acres and acres of rainforest every single day. Now we get to industrialized agriculture. Industrialized agriculture is a kind we practice here in the United States with big farms. So we have these mega farms that they're thousands of acres of the same crop. We call that a monoculture. They use lots of water, irrigation is present. They often use a lot of pesticides, and so they produce large quantities of food, but they also use a lot of other materials, a lot of other resources producing those crops. Now in the tropics there's also industrialized agriculture. We call this plantation agriculture for those tropical type plants. We're talking about soybeans, coffee, bananas, coconuts, and chocolate, which is cacao here. Now I mentioned green revolution already. There's actually been two green revolutions in the world. The first one looked to increase yield without regard to any kinds of consequence. So in this case, monocultures were created. So this is when you got thousands and thousands of acres of the same crop, just corn or just wheat. There's lots of fertilizer, lots of pesticides, a lot of water to produce high yields. They also would increase the intensity of the cropping, so they might plant two different crops on the same field. So they might plant corn and then later on plant some beans on the same field and have two harvests on the same field. So this is very intense type of agriculture. And so that was the first green revolution, and it really did increase the amount of food on the planet. Right now we're going through the second green revolution. The second green revolution is basically focused on using technologies for better farming. So the use of GPS to be more efficient in your planting, for example. A lot of those large farm tractors now are run totally by GPS systems that can be very efficient in planting your field to get the highest yield out of it. Other things happen with genetic development, where we can now take genes from one organism and splice them into another organism to increase our yields. For example, this right here is what we call yellow rice. Typically, rice doesn't have a whole lot of vitamin A in it, and so in those countries that grow lots of rice, there's usually a lot of vitamin A deficiency. Well, some researchers took a vitamin A producing gene and put it into some rice and created this yellow strain of rice. So this rice has high vitamin A in it. Countries that grow rice, they can grow this now and have less vitamin A deficiencies. So those kind of things are happening with genetically modified crops. And other things that have happened in the United States is that we have basically maxed out the amount of farmland we have. If you look here, the darkest green here are the areas where we have the largest amount of farmland per acre. This is a percentage over here, so 80% or more of the acreage in these areas is farmland. Those areas that have very good soils, very good water ability to get water, are those areas where we have high intensity farming, and this is what we call the breadbasket of the United States. If you look, we follow the Mississippi on down, and the Mississippi floodplain is also a very fertile area where a lot of agriculture occurs. We down here in Florida, and we don't have a whole lot down here except down here just south of Lake Okeechobee, where we have lots of sugar cane happening. But we've basically maxed out all of our arable, and arable land is that land that's able to be planted. So we've basically maxed that out in the United States. The rest of these areas that don't have a whole lot of agriculture going on in them, basically they don't have the ability to really support large crops. And so there's not a whole lot of farming that happens there. Either the soil's poor, or the climate's not right, or it doesn't get enough rain, or it gets too much rain. It's just not the right conditions for growing crops. If you see here, this is our land use in the United States for raising crops. Right now, 42% of the land here basically is farmable, but not just any kind of crop can be farmed on it. Some of it's limited, and then soil protection practices are required, and we'll get into what some of those are a little bit later. Also, there's a lot of marginal land. So marginal land is that area that's right next to the crop that doesn't usually get planted. Sometimes it's not the best kind of land. It might be right up next to the fence or next to a road. And so that's 12%. And usually it only grows crops in the best of years. This little small sliver down here, this 2% right here, this basically has no limitation. This is the best land for farming. It has no limitation. You basically grow crops on it, and it doesn't matter what you grow, it'll do well. And then this is the big part here. In the United States, 44% of the United States is not suitable for growing any kind of crop whatsoever. And so we are basically stuck with only farming this area, and some of it's not the best farmland either. Now, I mentioned genetic engineering a little bit earlier, and this has become a big hot button topic for a lot of people, but GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, are becoming more and more prevalent out there. in the grocery store. And you may not know it, but a lot of the foods that you buy at the grocery store, a lot of the corn, a lot of the cotton that you wear in your jeans, soybeans, canola oil, these are all genetically modified for the most part now. It's very hard to get ungenetically modified products. For example, corn. If you're in the Midwest, it's almost impossible to buy genetically unmodified corn. Now, we have been messing with genetics for quite a long time, but we weren't splicing genes. We were doing what we call artificial selection, which is when man took two organisms that had specific traits that we wanted to bring out, and we bred them together. And we've done this with cows, and we've done it with dogs, and we've done it with all kinds of organisms. The problem is that if we do it with crops, it takes about 15 years to get a viable crop. And then the new strains will remain useful for about 5 to 10 years before something is bred out of them, or their ability to really produce a lot of yield is bred out of them. So now we're actually taking snippets of DNA from one organism and putting it into another. You can do this. They've done this with tomatoes to give them cold tolerance in some areas so the tomatoes don't freeze. You can do this to increase yield, to increase pest resistance, to increase pesticide resistance. Monsanto company here in the United States has developed a type of corn that cannot be killed by Roundup. And so you can spray your entire field with Roundup, kill all the weeds, but you don't kill the corn. Other varieties have been bred for drought tolerance. And so all these different things are happening in the genetic world. And like I said, a lot of people have problems with genetically modified foods. I suggest you find out a little bit more about GMOs before you make up your mind whether they're bad or good at this point. Well, that's the lecture on agriculture and foods. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in class.